Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Step by Step. Today we're going to be figuring out what's the right deck to play for the meta, and we're going to do so by looking at the results from the Seattle Regional Tournament that took place last weekend, plus discussing a few key concepts and then going over a few deck lists at the end. Now, I call my channel Step by Step because my goal here is really just to help walk you guys through the step-by-step process of making good decisions, whether that's picking the right deck, building the right deck, or making the right moves in matchups, so I'm really excited to be bringing you this type of video. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results from Seattle. One thing probably jumps out right away at everybody. There were 24 Garbodor decks that top cut into the top 32. 17 of those Garbodor decks were just the Drampa version. 4 of those decks were just the Espeon version. 1 was a combination of Espeon and Drampa, 1 was the Tauros Tapu Lele version, and 1 was ya boy Trevenant. I wish the Trevenant version had done a little bit better, but hey, at least it got top cut. There were about 400 players, so who knows how many of each deck were played. We also had 4 Decidueyes make top cut. One of those Decidueyes was the Ninetales variant. Then we had 1 Mega Rayquaza, 1 Vespiquen, which you guys are all probably pretty familiar with since it finished in second and the list was posted on Facebook, and 1 Ninetales variant and 1 Lapras variant, which made top 8. So, interpreting these results, you might be inclined to say, oh, well, Garbodor Drampa is easily the best deck in the format. There's nothing that competes with it. We should ban Garbodor, yada, 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 but that's not true. In my opinion, whenever you're going to a regional tournament, you usually want to play something that's safe and consistent and that has good matchups across the board. Well, we also just got a new format with the release of Guardians Rising. As I discussed in my last video about the top 25 decks for Standard, the format is completely different now. So, with a new format, a big tournament that requires a lot of consistency when deciding what deck you should play, it's pretty easy to see how Garbodor did well. If you look around at different Facebook groups or just talk to different people, Garbodor was good at a lot of local tournaments, but it didn't dominate like it did at regionals. I really think it dominated at regionals because it was just such a consistent and good deck to play, and because the format is so new that everyone just chose to be safe and decided to play Garbodor. Like I was saying, if you look at some of the more local tournaments, you'll see a lot of kind of random and weird stuff, and a lot of which we've talked about in previous step-by-step videos, that ended up making it into the top cut or even winning the tournament. So I definitely don't think that just because this tournament had Garbodor represented so highly that is like the end-all be-all. This is what the meta is now. There's a lot of stuff that can counter Garbodor Drampa. We just have to, as a player base, get kind of courageous and try these things out and see what we can come up with and then actually bring them to the tournaments. I also wanted to mention that the one Vespiquen that top cut, we talked about that in the last video as well, the top 25 decks for Standard. I rated it as a in development deck because I wasn't 100% comfortable with my list yet, but I knew it had a lot of potential, and I'm really happy to see that it finished in second place. One of my good friends went to this tournament as well, and he said that Decidueye was extremely popular. It didn't do that well. Only 4 of them made top cut. And the reason for this, I think, is because an early Drampa puts a lot of pressure on Decidueye. Plus, Decidueye really can't, like, let's just say there's no damage on anywhere on the field. Decidueye can't Feather Arrow anywhere except for the active. So you basically just have to wait until you can attack with Razor Leaf for 92 times against Drampa GX to knock it out. That's basically the only play that you have if you're Decidueye. And as you know, if you've ever played Decidueye, it's not the easiest thing in the world to set up Decidueye Vileplume and get both energies on Decidueye to attack by turn 2 or 3, and to do all that before getting knocked out by a Drampa hitting you for 150 damage. Of course, Magma Base and all that stuff, Rainbow Energy, helps Drampa achieve this. It's no secret how that deck works. So I think the early pressure from Drampa put a lot of hurt on the Decidueye players. Also, Drampa pressure on the Greninja is probably a reason why we didn't see any Greninja's top cut. When you combine the fact that Drampa can do a lot of early pressure on a Greninja deck, Not one-shotting the Greninja break, but one-shotting Greninjas, Frogadier, Froakie, all that stuff pretty early. A good or consistent Garbodor Drampa list can get up by 2 or 3 prizes on a Greninja, and then of course you can always just attach a Float Stone and they have to Lysander and kill the Garbodor or run into their Field Blowers to be able to use the damage drop again. So having to manage all of that stuff plus going down a couple of prizes early could have made Greninja kind of a tough play. Normally it's good versus Garbodor. I still think it has a positive matchup versus Garbodor, but I think that could have hindered it as well. Also, like I heard from my friend who was at the tournament, it just looked like a lot of players were playing Decidueye when he was walking around the convention center. So I think Decidueye plus early Drampa pressure kind of hurt the Greninja. And I just think it was underrepresented. I don't think a lot of people showed up with Greninja either. So, and then where was Gyarados? There's no Gyarados in the top cut here. I think the issue with Gyarados at the moment is just that the Azelf or whatever you want to run that spreads damage plus a Float Stone on the Garbotoxin Garbodor really hurts the Gyarados deck. That plus Decidueye being popular, which is a pretty good matchup for Decidueye, kind of made it not very easy for Gyarados to find success. I think that could change. I definitely think that we could see Gyarados become popular again in the future, especially as the format changes. But for now, I'm not 100% sure how well Gyarados would be to play, unless, of course, we see the Decidueyes drop in popularity, which I think they probably will after this. So at the moment, I do think Gyarados is a good deck, but I think it's going to need a little bit more time before it becomes super popular again or have some things change in the metagame. If people kind of figure out a bunch of different options and ideas to counter Gyarados, and then, or excuse me, to counter Garbodor, and then Gyarados counters those decks, then Gyarados could be really strong again. The same thing applies for Decidueye. So let's take a look at how to pick the right deck based on what we learned. First of all, in order to pick the right deck, one thing you have to get right. You have to beat Garbodor Drampa, and you have to beat Garbodor Espeon. If you can't get past number 1 on this list, then just stop trying with that deck. It's not going to work. If Garbodor Drampa or Espeon are a rough matchup, it's best to just move on to something else. Number 2, you've got to be able to beat 2 out of the 3 of the following decks: Vespiquen, Decidueye, and Gyarados. Vespiquen placed number 2. It has a decently good matchup against Garbodor. It beats a lot of things that are built to beat Garbodor, like Greninja or Lapras. It's a pretty strong play. The prize trade is really good too because it can trade really well with things like Gardevoir or Alola Ninetales or whatever else you have out. Even Drampa can give you a little bit of an advantage in prizes. So I think you really need to be able to beat Vespiquen, and then who knows what's going to be played after that. If you can just beat Vespiquen and then either Decidueye or Gyarados, I think you're off to a good start. Number 3, I definitely think you need to be able to beat 2 out of the 3 between Gardevoir, Greninja, and Lapras. And I rank these 3 down here. They are all really good. They have decent matchups versus Garbodor, but Greninja and Lapras are weak to Vespiquen and Decidueye, and I think that kind of hurts. Gardevoir should have a fairly tough matchup with Gyarados, and I don't know if Gardevoir can keep up with the prize trade of a Vespiquen. So although all the decks here on number 3 are really good, I don't know if they're better than the decks in number 2. So for me, I still think the meta is extremely diverse. It's way more diverse than it appears. I think the upcoming weekend from local tournaments plus the regional that's happening in Madison, Wisconsin will help us see a little bit more diversity of the format. But really, at the moment, thinking of the top 15 or so decks, I mean, how many do we have listed here? We got Garbodor, Drampa, Espeon, plus 6, and then the bottom has 6 more. So that's 12. We got 14 decks listed right here. And there's obviously more stuff that you can play, but you could really honestly run into any one of these decks at any tournaments. So we can't think, okay, I gotta find a deck that beats all 14 of these decks. Like, that's just not possible. Basically, if you can have a positive matchup with Garbodor Drampa, a positive matchup with Garbodor Espeon, beat 2 out of the 3 from Vespiquen, Decidueye, Gyarados, beat 2 out of the 3 from Gardevoir, Greninja, and Lapras, you're going to be fine. Whatever deck it is that does all of that stuff, I'm sure you'll beat 2 or 3 of the decks listed at the bottom. I say we can't try to beat all of these and list the 6 decks at the bottom because I don't really feel super great about their matchups right now. I think Rayquaza has a bit of a tough time with Garbodor. It has a bit of a tough time with Gyarados. I don't know if it can handle Vespiquen. So I don't know if Rayquaza is really primed to do anything at the moment. Volcanion has a rough matchup with Garbodor. It has a rough matchup with Gyarados. It has a rough matchup with Greninja. It could even have a rough matchup with Lapras. So I just don't think Volcanion is too great of a play right now, but I could definitely see people playing it just because it's so fast and strong. Sylveon has a really hard time winning 2 games in a 30-minute best-of-3 format versus Garbodor. Alolan Ninetales can beat Garbodor Drampa and beat Garbodor Espeon pretty well, but it should struggle pretty hard with things like Gyarados, Rayquaza, and different things like that. Maybe even Decidueye, it all kind of depends, maybe even Vespiquen. It's a couple matchups I'd need to try a little bit more, but you can't build a deck in mind and build a deck and then think, oh, well, I can't beat Alolan Ninetales, so I need to scrap the deck. Like, I don't think Alolan Ninetales is going to be that popular. It's great. It's got a good Garbodor matchup, but I think it struggles with some of the decks that are built to counter Garbodor. Same thing for Lycanroc GX. I think Lycanroc, particularly paired with Raichu, has a pretty good Garbodor Drampa in matchup. I'm not so sure about the Garbodor Espeon matchup. And then I do think it would struggle a little bit with Vespiquen and Decidueye, so for those reasons, I'm not going to build a deck thinking, how do I beat Lycanroc? And then for Tapu Koko, every matchup that I've played from Garbodor versus Tapu Koko, I mean, Garbodor kind of wins that one. I mean, I haven't had any issues with Garbodor beating Tapu Koko at all. Tapu Koko is a really good deck, and it can beat a lot of the things that beat Garbodor, but I just don't know if it can beat Garbodor. From my testing, I haven't been able to handle Garbodor that well with Tapu Koko, or when I've been playing Garbodor, the matchup just seems fairly easy, to be completely honest. So, but think about this. Let's say you can beat Garbodor Drampa and Garbodor Espeon, maybe not 100% of the time, but let's say you've got a 60-40 or 65-35 matchup against it. That's pretty good. And then let's say you can beat 4 out of the next 6. So, at any given tournament, probably 50 to 60% of the decks are going to be Garbodor. So you have a winnable matchup versus, we'll just say, 60% of the field. And then, if the rest of the field, the remaining 40%, if half of that are the decks listed here at number 2 and number 3, then you are beating 2/3 of those decks, or basically 66%. So you have a good matchup versus 60% of the field. Then you have a good matchup of 66% of the remaining 20% of the field, which is roughly 2, 4, 6, we'll just say 14% of the rest of the field. So that gives you a decent matchup with 74% of the field. And then whatever you're playing, I'm sure it'll have a matchup, or I'm sure it'll have a decent matchup versus like half of the decks listed at the bottom. So if the other 20% of the field, if you have a good matchup versus half of it, that's 10%. So you're looking at roughly a good matchup versus 75 to 80, 85% of the field. I'll take that right now. As long as you can beat Garbodor Drampa and a couple of the things that counter Garbodor Drampa, I think you've got yourself a good deck. So, there's a couple of things, before we get into some of the ideas that I think can achieve this, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. 2 tips. 1, you can't tech for everything. You have to be consistent. Build the most consistent deck first. Play against Garbodor Drampa, Garbodor Espeon. Make sure you can beat that. And then play against the remaining 6 decks. If you find, hey, I'm only beating 3 out of these 6, and I need to make a change that keeps consistency but beats Vespiquen or beats Greninja, whatever, that's fine. But make your adjustment on your tech after you get your consistent list down that beats Garbodor. You can't think, oh, well, I need to beat Decidueye, I need to beat metal decks that might show up, so I'm going to run a Flareon line. I need to make sure I beat Vespiquen, so I'm going to throw a Karen in there. Gyarados seems like a tough match, so I'm going to put a Spinda in there as well. What about Greninja? I need to run the Giratina, and then if someone's playing Rayquaza, I know I can't beat it, so I have to put Sudowoodo. No, okay, it's time to calm down. Let's just not worry about teching for everything in the format. Start with consistency, and then look at your techs from there. I will say this, though. For supporters, a supporter tech is usually much easier to fit in a deck than a Pokemon tech. it's way easier to Hex Maniac the Greninja a couple turns in a row than it is to play a Giratina down and hope they don't have access to a Silent Lab, because then they can just blow your tech out of the water anyway. It doesn't matter. Kind of the same thing for putting a Float Stone or a Choice Band on a Garbotoxin Garbodor. If they access their Field Blower, then it doesn't matter. But if you play a Hex, then that is a guaranteed stopping of whatever it is you need to stop for at least one turn. It does take away from your consistency if you can't play supporter, but it does get the job done. Same thing for Karen. If you find that Vespiquen is just so popular or whatever, you can always just stream you can play one Karen and then just stream that Karen over and over again if you need to. So supporter techs are a little easier to fit in a deck. It's not always the best thing in the world. Like, let's just say you're playing Azelf or Tapu Koko to counter Gyarados. I don't know. And then you don't see a Gyarados all day, and you start with your Azelf or Tapu Koko 3 times. Like, what's the point, you know? So build the deck consistent first, and then move on to your techs and see if there's maybe one thing that you need to do just to swing a matchup into your favor. Also, on a side note, Oricorio is sort of a tech for Gyarados and for Vespiquen, because if they have 3 Pokemon in the discard pile versus Gyarados, and you can Hex Maniac them or put a tool on the Garbodor, you can use Supernatural Dance to put damage counters on Magikarps to knock out 3, as long as, like I said, they have 3 Pokemon in the discard pile. And then against Vespiquen, who knows, let's say they have 15 Pokemon in the discard pile, then you're dropping 15 damage counters however you want, which is okay, but they may just recover another Vespiquen. So Oricorio sort of hits 2 birds with 1 stone. Tapu Koko does the most spread damage to anything. Aside from Azelf, Azelf equals Tapu Koko's spread damage if you are playing Magma Base and already have 20 damage on stuff on the bench. So anyways, there's a lot to think through here. Spinda's not bad if you don't run Psychics, or if you don't run Magma Base, or if you don't run Double Colorless Energies. So, I mean, like I said, there's a lot to think through. Just build your deck consistently first. That's the best thing that you can do. Number 2, play a best of 3, 30 minutes, going second every single time. Game 1, you go second. Game 2, you go first. If you lost or whatever. Game 3, you go second. Just go second as much as possible against everything. Time it for 30 minutes. Like, who cares if you can beat Garbodor if it takes you 45 minutes to win 2 games? That doesn't matter, because that's not going to happen at the tournament. So 30 minutes, best of 3, going second. That's what you want to do. Now, what are a couple of things that I think can achieve what we need to do? Well, here's some deck lists for you guys. This is Gyarados. Gyarados kind of all depends on how consistently your opponent can shut off Machoke, plus run the tech that we listed on the previous screen to damage all the Magikarps. And can they do that enough to where they can win the game in just a couple of turns? So taking a look at the Gyarados list at the bottom of the screen, it kind of cuts it off on PTCGO. I don't know why, but it's 1 Teammates, 3 Choice Band, 1 Float Stone, and 4 Double Colorless Energies. Gyarados is a fairly well-known deck. Lists are kind of everywhere online. This is just kind of how I've got it running right now. I think at the moment it may not be the best time to play Gyarados, but like I said earlier, if the techs kind of go away because no one's really thinking about it, don't sleep on it. It could always come back out of nowhere. And if people aren't playing techs to beat Gyarados, it's easily one of, if not the best deck in the format. Deck number 2, we've got Greninja Break. I think that Greninja Break obviously has a decent matchup versus Garbodor, but with Vespiquen becoming popular again, I'm a little nervous about Greninja Break. You'd almost have to run a Jirachi and see if you can find a way to get around it that way. So I'm not super sold on Greninja Break at the moment. I was a little bit more before the tournament that happened over the weekend, but now I'm not so sure. But this is just kind of your standard Greninja list. It's widely based off a couple of lists that I saw online that did really well. I liked Greninja last season a lot. I'm not, because it had such a good Night March matchup. I'm not a huge fan of it right now, especially since Decidueye was popular last tournament in Seattle, and like I said, with Vespiquen becoming popular. So I'm not 100% sold on Greninja, but this is kind of the list, and I think it at least can beat Garbodor, and then maybe beat 3 or 4 of the next decks listed on the 2 of 3 that I mentioned earlier. Now we get into one that I'm super excited about and super proud of. The Lurantis GX Lurantis promo deck. This is updated from even the last list that I posted in the last video. I playtested this deck a lot this weekend, and it has a really good Garbodor Drampa matchup. It's very, very easy and consistent to get a turn 1 Lurantis GX using Flower Supply to do 40 damage and attaching 2 Grass Energies from the discard pile to itself. It's pretty easy to do that. I think I probably get that on, if I'm going second on turn 1, probably half the games I played, at least, if not more. And then to get that by turn 2, I mean, that's basically every game. The HP is high. You don't have to play a lot of trainer or item cards to be able to get your stuff out that you need. It's a really, really, really strong deck, and I highly recommend trying it out. There are a couple problems with this deck, though. It cannot beat Gyarados. There's no way. It cannot beat Rayquaza, it cannot beat Volcanion, and it has a really hard time with anything that has a surprise Flareon tech. So the more popular Decidueye is, the worse this deck is going to be. If Decidueye is not very popular, or if some metal deck's not very popular, then this deck would be pretty good if people aren't playing, like I said, Volcanion or Flareon, and I really just don't think Rayquaza is going to be super popular anyway. And we'll see about Gyarados. This deck is primed to be in a really good spot. Like I said, if the techs for Gyarados are super popular and that makes the deck not played very much, Rayquaza continues to have a bad or iffy-ish matchup with Garbodor, Volcanion has a bad matchup with Garbodor, plus all the other water decks in the format, and then we don't see many Flareon techs because there's no popular metal, or Decidueye starts to kind of fade away, this deck is really, 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 really strong. I highly recommend testing it out. The issue I've been having with it on PTCGO, as you can see, I only run one Tapu Lele on PTCGO because I only have one. In real life, I have 2. So I start a lot better in real life than I do on PTCGO. I mulligan a lot. Having that one extra basic Pokemon is a big deal. So my real life testing is way better with this deck than the PTCGO testing, simply because I just kind of mulligan or dead draw because I've already got my Tapu Lele in play instead of having 2 Tapu Lele in the deck, so which I think it needs to. So this is a really good list. Try it out. Let me know what you think. Then we've got Alolan Ninetales. Alolan Ninetales is really good because it can counter Garbodor pretty well, but I do think it's going to struggle with Rayquaza and Gyarados. That's my biggest concern. If those decks go down and no metal decks emerge, this deck could be super, super strong. As you see, I've got 1 Spinda just in case it runs into a Gyarados. I mean, the matchup is just that bad, but you could cut Spinda for something if you want, if you don't expect Gyarados to be popular. Yeah, so this is the Ninetales deck. I think it's really solid play right now, and it definitely achieves the basics of the goals that I mentioned earlier in the video. Next, we've got my baby. We've got Garbodor Trevenant. I really, really, really like this deck. It's super strong. It's got a really great early game, which is something that is kind of tough for Garbodor to say, which is why the main Garbodor deck partners with Drampa, because you want to be able to have a really strong early game. Trevenant can give you the same damage output as Drampa, and it can do it on turn 2, and it can do it without putting damage counters on yourself, and it can do it with a non-GX giving up 2 prize attacker. Or it doesn't. It all depends on what's in your opponent's hand, and that's the biggest issue with this deck. I play 4N because the opponents obviously are going to manage their hand to the point where they don't have many trainers or supporters in them, and then you just want to end them and fill their hand right back up. So I've found that Poltergeist does what I want it to do probably 75 to 80% of the time. I wish it was 100% of the time, but I mean, that's why I'm trying this deck with Vespiquen, just to see if I can have a little bit more reliable 1 prize attacker that takes advantage of DCE. But this is a really solid deck. I mean, usually you start out with Trevenant for a few attacks, and then late game, when they can't really keep up with what you've done so far, they have to play their items, so Garbodor swings like halfway through the game and takes a lot of prizes. It's a really good deck because of the prize equity. I mean, you really aren't playing down much stuff that gives up 2 prizes. Obviously, the Shaman's an issue, but the weird thing about Poltergeist is, like, sometimes you'll hit for like 150 damage or 120 damage, and then you can just put a Choice Band and a DCE on your Shaman that's in play and Sky Return right back to your hand to get the knockout and eliminate the prize equity that you have in play. So I mean, it's it really is a good deck, and it really kind of forces your opponent to take 6 prizes, which is awesome. The bottom cards are 3 Float Stone, 4 DCE, and 8 Psychic Energies. I really think this one achieves everything that I've got listed the deck needs to do to be able to be considered. The only iffy part, like I said, is when you Poltergeist, do they have the cards in their hand that you need to get the knockout? And at the end of the game, when you're ending them for 2 or 3, Poltergeist is pointless. So you have to hope by the end of the game that Trevenant has put enough pressure on the opponents that there's enough stuff in the discard pile for Garbodor to take advantage of. Speaking of which, we can always try Vespiquen with Garbodor. So this one focuses more on Vespiquen than on Garbodor. The differences between this deck and the Trevenant version are the early game. Early game, you're doing 120 to 150 damage, if not 180 with a Choice Band, with your Poltergeist really, really early. With this deck, you're probably doing 70, 80, 100 maybe for the first couple of turns. And then as things progress throughout the match, you're going to start doing much more damage. Now, this one's pretty cool. Now, you'll notice I don't run any Revitalizers. That's because I want to be able to rescue, stretch, or out Garbodor, since I only run 2 of the Trashlands Garbodors. But this deck is pretty cool, like I said, because it is more consistent late game than the Trevenant version. Not as fast early game, more consistent late game. I don't know. I like both versions. I'm a little bit more biased towards the Trevenant version at the moment. It kind of all depends on the meta. If people start countering Vespiquen, then this isn't going to be as good. And then there's a couple other decks. I mean, you know, if you run into a super fast Greninja that can just drop all the damage on your Vespiquens and Combees, then yeah, I mean, that's kind of rough, especially if they blow away the tool. That's another thing too about this deck. You only have 4 tool cards, and you're running the Garbotoxin Garbodor. It's pretty tough to be able to get Garbotoxin consistently in play with only 4 tool cards. I still consider this list to be in progress, but I just wanted to at least show it to you guys. I mean, maybe you could cut, I don't know, maybe you could cut a Forest of Giant Plants or a Klefki to get a 5th tool card, get another Float Stone in there. I really wish I had another Psychic Energy. There's just not much space in this list. But yeah, I mean, it's not a bad list. It's really not. I mean, I think I've won... I haven't lost a Garbodor yet with it, and I think I've only lost one game maybe with this so far. So it's a pretty good deck, but I mean, hey, it just needs a lot more work. And that's it, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the deck list. I hope you enjoyed the discussion on how to figure out which deck is the right deck to play. And go out there and try some stuff, try some things on your own. I definitely still think Metagross has a lot of viability in the format right now. I think Lycanroc Raichu is also pretty decent as well. Try a bunch of stuff out and see how you can do. Keep in mind, things will be a little bit more random at your local tournaments than they are at big tournaments like the Madison or the Mexico City regionals coming up, or even nationals. Well, who knows at nationals, things can always be a little crazy there, but definitely keep trying new ideas, and always remember when you're playing Pokemon to have fun. Thanks, guys.